Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So, this is the day 2 of Quran Today session. So, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in wa man tabi'ahum biridwanin ila yawmiddin. So normally for the first 2 to 3 days of Taraweeh, we recite Surah Al-Baqarah. It's a long surah and it's difficult to summarize the whole surah in a matter of 1 or 2 sessions of 30 minutes each. So what I will do is pick up some pertinent concepts from the surah and elaborate on them as we go along. Today, what I want to do is take up the surah as a whole and discuss its place in Quran and its importance and whatever has been narrated about this surah, and then go through some of the sections into which the surah can be divided and how to approach the surah. So this is in the Quran in which we find this is the second surah of the Quran. The first surah is Al-Fatiha and the second surah is the Al-Baqarah. And it was placed there not based on a chronological order, because as we know, Quran was revealed in a certain order on Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And most of the time he used to receive only a couple of verses. I mean, if you divide 6,236 verses over a matter of 23 years, even every day the amount that would be revealed will not be much. But certainly there are certain surahs in Quran about which the evidence is that they came down as a whole, and this is not one of them. This surah is considered mostly Madani, but it contains a lot of verses that were also revealed in Makkah, especially the last portion of the surah, the last dua that we recite in the last few verses of the surah. Those were certainly revealed in Makkah and not in Medina. So when a person asks Allah in Surah Al-Fatiha, Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim, O Allah, guide us to the straight path, show us the way, show us the straight path. And it almost appears that this is the answer to that prayer. And the answer to that prayer starts from this surah. An answer to that prayer starts with Zalikal Kitabu La Rayba Fi Hudal Lil Muttaqin. That this is the Hidayah, this is the book, this is what it contains, what you asked for. And so in that sense, this is a first step towards the straight path that we sought from Allah, seek from Allah. This is the first step towards understanding that straight path. First steps towards understanding what's the structure, what is framework, who will receive the Hidayah, who will not receive the Hidayah. All of that is contained in this particular surah. And the more we reflect on this surah, the more it is a source of wisdom. The more one ponders over it, the more depth he can gain in, or she can gain in terms of understanding this surah. According to one narration from Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anh, that it took him and his group to study the surah, it took them over 8 years to study it. 8 years to understand every single verse of the surah from the companions of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So and it also conveys the importance of understanding this surah. There's also another narration from Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in which he said, For everything there is a pinnacle, and the pinnacle of Quran is Surah Al-Baqarah. Whoever recites it in the day, Shaitan would not enter his house during the day. And whoever recites it during the night, Shaitan will not enter his house for 3 nights. So oftentimes when people go and inhabit new houses or houses that were not inhabited before, based on this tradition, people have come up that they recite Surah Al-Baqarah in any new place, any new dwelling that they go to. It has been a tradition among some Muslims. And also there's another hadith from Abu Huraira radiallahu anh, which says, don't turn your houses into graves, because Shaitan does not enter into a house in which Al-Baqarah is recited. And this is a hadith that is quoted in Sahih al-Muslim and quoted and narrated by Abu Huraira radiallahu anh, that in the absence of a Surah Baqarah being recited in a house, that house can turn into a grave, means it will be devoid of blessings and of being inhabited by the good things that we look for in a dwelling. Another hadith, again from Sahih Muslim, says, recite the Quran, it will be an intercessor for its companions. Recite the two luminous ones, Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran. For on the day of judgment, they will come as two clouds on or canopies, or two flocks of birds in ranks, pleading for those who recite them, making an intercession for them. So recite Al-Baqarah, for in learning it is a blessing, and neglecting it results in great remorse, and only the lazy do not recite it. So because this is a very lengthy, long surah, the tradition for us, those who memorize only small portions of the Quran, is to usually memorize the last juz and surahs from last juz, because they are easy and they are short. But the importance of this one particular surah, Surah Baqarah, is if you read the narrations and the traditions, is actually great. And although it's true about the whole of the Quran, but this particular surah as well, that even though every revelation came to Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam at a particular time, at a particular location, addressing a particular people who were relevant at the time when the revelation was being made. But the way Quran is we find with us is not in that chronological order. It has lost that chronological order, and it cannot even be determined with certainty about every verse or a particular sequence of surahs, that what the chronological order of these surahs were is not determinable. And so now the surahs are organized in a manner in which, if we start to recite the surahs, then we will recite them in this order, in this manner. And then order makes a difference. I mean, there is a minority of people who go by the idea that there is no order in Quran. It's all haphazard, it's all random. There is no connection between the surah. There's no connection between verses, because oftentimes you are perplexed by the fact that you are reading a surah, even within a surah, a certain topic is going, and suddenly the direction will change and something else will be discussed, or some topic is being discussed and there will be a tangent where something else will come in for one or two verses, and then it will continue. And so on the basis of that, people can sometimes think that there is no order in Quran. But there is a particular order in Quran, and that order is something that was revealed to Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam through Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, that whenever he will receive a revelation, he will be instructed, and he will instruct his writers that where to attach these verses that he was revealing at that particular, that why he was getting at that particular time. And so that instruction is from Allah, that where the verses will go. And if it was random, then it didn't matter whether it was in a chronological order or whatever order, it would have worked. But putting a particular order into the Quran and sticking with that order shows that there is a structure to Quran. And if there is a structure to Quran, then we also must understand that there must be a significance in terms of how we understand Quran and how we understand that structure, how that helps us in understanding the Quran. And so we need to reflect on how, when into an answer to the prayer of Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim, this surah was placed first. And it starts with Alif Lam Mim Zalikal Kitabu La Raiba Fi, and it continues on. And what the subject matter of this surah is, how that is relevant as a structure to be able to fully comprehend this path to the straight hidayah, to the straight path, to the guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed. And so it's important to understand it in that sense. So sometimes if you reflect on it, and it is based on other scholars who have gone through it, that surah can be, you can look at a very broad divisions in this surah, very broad sections that can be deduced from the subject matter that the surah contains. The first part of the surah, the first 100 to 140 verses, contains the basics of divine guidance. It contains who will be guided by it, who will not be guided by it. It talks about people, khatam Allahu ala qulubihim, that there are people whose hearts are sealed, and whose hearts are sealed, so they are unable to comprehend this hidayah. They are unable to benefit from what is being revealed. The second very long section would be, contains about, actually starts from the verse 40, and it contains the story of Bani Israel, and it's almost exclusively talks about their conduct with respect to the hidayah, that they were given the revelation through Musa alayhi salam, they were given the Torah, and their conduct with respect to that hidayah that came to them and how it was. And there is a lot of condemnation of that behavior throughout the surah. And so it deals with that in the very beginning. And so we need to understand what purpose that serves for us. And then you can go on to the next section, which may be from ayah 124 to 152, which talks about the Qibla and the transfer of responsibility, and that the responsibility is not hereditary. And I can go through a little bit more detail about each of these sections, just delineating what these sections are at the moment. And then the verses 153 to 177 describe the characteristics that one must have to enable himself or herself to shoulder the responsibility of receiving this hidayah, acting on this hidayah, implementing your life on this hidayah. What are some of the very basic characteristics of that? And so you find verses like Laysal birran tuwallu wujuhakum qibal al-mashriqi wal-maghrib, and so on. So these are the verses that describe the characteristics of those who try to go on this straight path. And then again, we come to some social laws and discussion of those, the qisas and property and instructions to develop self-discipline and going to Hajj and jihad and social life in general. And so these elaborate the Sharia which is given to the Ummah, and it puts a shape, a structure on your system of practice in the world. And then it continues that to be able to follow this hidayah, to be able to implement that structure, you need a life of jihad and struggle and infaq. So you see verses 243 to 283 focus on jihad, so focus on infaq, the need to for you to be able to spend from what Allah has given you, to be able to exert yourself, to be able to spend energy on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed in all the structure that is defined in here. And then it also talks about limits of personal responsibility, la yukallifullah nafsan illa wus'aha. And then it contains a beautiful prayer that was made. And the prayer was made at the time when the believers were being persecuted. And maybe in the next session or one after, we will focus on that particular prayer and the context of that prayer, and understand what that prayer is teaching us, inshallah. So one of the concepts that I want to pick up today, and it I think there's a lot of misgivings and misunderstandings regarding this whole section, is that there is a great level of criticism of Bani Israel in this surah, and how they behave with respect to the hidayah that was given to them, and what is the purpose of that. Sometimes, I mean, and there are other places in Quran where Quran criticizes other communities that were current at the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or historical, who have passed away. And Quran discusses them. Quran discusses their psychology. Quran discusses in what ways they deviated and they went astray. And so the purpose of anything in Quran is not to condemn certain people for all times to come. That cannot be the purpose in the Quran. But the purpose is to guide us to something. Because Quran is a hidayah for believers. Quran is a hidayah to accept it as the book of hidayah. Quran is a hidayah for those who are reciting it. And its purpose is not to take verses from Quran and reciting them on others and say that you are not good person, good people. That cannot be the purpose of this criticism that we find in Surah Al-Baqarah that is being recited these days in the Taraweeh prayer, and it's a long section. Ya Bani Israel askuru ni'mati allati an'amtu alaykum wa anni faddaltukum ala al-alamin. O Bani Israel, remember my favors upon you, and how I favored you and I raised you above other people in the society. So Allah is talking about the honor that He gave to them. And Allah is talking about that He chose them. And Allah is talking about that He sent His revelation to them. And Allah is talking about messengers, not just one, but one after another, a series of messengers who were sent to them. And so you can understand how much importance Allah gave to those people. And so in that sense, we need to understand that it is not just a simple condemnation, but it is also something that draws before us a picture. So the picture it draws, and the lesson that we need to draw from that picture, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places before us a mirror, that here is a new revelation. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. This is the book which is the hidayah for those who have taqwa. And so if this is the hidayah, then you need to understand in what ways it is possible for you to deviate from it. And instead of delineating those ways in a theoretical framework, it places before us history of mankind. History of mankind, the history of past revelations, and history of past revelation as to what and how people dealt with that revelation, and how with the passage of time, people started to deviate from it. And what kind of conduct, what kind of behavior is acceptable towards hidayah, and what kind of behavior is not acceptable and not beneficial to those who receive this hidayah. So it is putting a mirror before us. And what it is doing by putting that mirror before us, that we are exactly capable of going on those same paths and conducting ourselves in exactly in the same conduct that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us a mirror against. So the purpose of these verses is not to put down certain people for all times to come. That is not the purpose. In the eyes of Allah, the human dignity and human worth and human value before Allah is same for every people, for every person. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it very clear that a person's worth and value, for an individual person's worth and value, will be determined when he will stand before Allah on the day of judgment, and his conduct will be measured, his taqwa will be measured, his great good and bad deeds will be measured, and on the basis of that, a person will be able to determine what his worth was in this life. And so we should look at it as a historical record and not as a condemnation of certain people that applies in your current life. And we need to look at these verses that this is showing a mirror to us and not something that we need to turn and show as a mirror to someone else. Because Quran is primarily a hidayah for those who recite it. Quran speaks intimately to you. Quran whispers to you. Quran affects your thoughts and your minds. So in that way, these verses are neither historical in their nature, that they are not trying to correct some historical record for us. These are not stories that are contained just as stories for us to go through them, but these are fundamental, critical verses that show us a mirror through which we can look at ourselves and judge ourselves and see if we are becoming a picture of that conduct. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us that if that happens, then instead of receiving his mercy and his rahmah, you will receive his wrath and you will be condemned. And that in that case, this whole hidayah is not going to be of any benefit to you. And so in that sense, when we go through this very long section in this surah, which deals with the story of Bani Israel and their conduct and with their response to all the different messengers that were sent to them and their personal conduct, then this is a mirror before us. That we and any other people who receive this hidayah, if they are human, if they are created with human traits and human characteristics, then this is the danger for them that you need to watch out. That Allah has created you in this place, placed you in this world, and given you these traits that are a mixture of both strengths and weaknesses. And so he asks us to guard against those weaknesses, that we guard ourselves against falling into the same traps and same errors. And so these are very critical verses. And it makes that clear even before the rest of the Quran comes. I mean, in the structure and the order in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has left this Quran for us, it shows that the importance of going through this before going through all of the rest of the Quran, that you need to understand the dangers and pitfalls before you pick up the rest of the Quran and you recite the rest of the Quran. And so that's the reason why it takes place in the first. That after you ask Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers that the dua by Dhalik al-Kitabu la rayba fi, and then it almost immediately, very soon, starts to discuss Bani Israel and their conduct. And so we need to be very clear based on real human conduct as to what are the pitfalls for us, where we can fall into errors, how we need to guard against our own psychic, our own psychology that can lead us into that direction. And so we must we must learn from these verses in that sense. So if you think about it in that way, you will find that when you are listening to them being recited, or when you are reciting them yourself, you will fully grasp the significance and critical nature of these verses, and not just look at them as historical record, as a description of certain people, as a story that is being given to us. And so we should never take any story in Quran as a story. Quran is not a book of stories. And Quran is not a parochial book that tries to raise certain people and condemn certain people in absolute sense. It's a book of hidayah. And it brings about the conduct of other human beings as examples before us, because that's the best way to explain to us, because the picture is worth more than the words. And the picture that it creates, it places before us, is there for us to take that lesson from the Quran. And if we take that lesson from the Quran and we understand these stories in that sense, then they become relevant for us. And if it becomes relevant for us, then you will recite these and you will apply it to yourself, and tears will flow from your eyes. You will be warmed. You will be alarmed. You will find out how these verses are speaking to you specifically, and not the people it is talking about. And so I think it's important to understand this whole section of Bani Israel, which is at the beginning, which is usually recited on the first day of Taraweeh. And so we need to understand what is the significance and what is the meaning of these stories in the Quran. And so I think I'm going to conclude that today's session here as an overall overview of the whole section of Bani Israel in the surah. And then I will pick up some other sections starting with tomorrow's session, inshallah. So, أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.